to start, what I'd like to do is say a few words about, perhaps my relationship with food over time, and sort of what my take is on food and diet and health today. And really, there's no better time to have this conversation, because everybody's thinking about health perhaps more than ever. And we're definitely seeing the links between our health and our underlying issues, and how COVID and the coronavirus are actually impacting those of us who have these underlying issues. And many of those issues, more than you can ever imagine, have to do with food that we eat, and how, and most importantly, how we eat it. So a real quick, maybe primer on my relationship with food. I've had a weird, sordid, mostly disconnected and unhealthy relationship with food for most of my life. I was an overweight kid, to the point where there was a year that, not only was I getting made fun of on a regular basis, but I got beat up almost every day in the lunch in sixth grade. I mean, every single day. And, I equated food with something that made me fat, or something that made me ugly, or something that made other kids make fun of me. And then I went almost directly into being an athlete, believe it or not. And I started wrestling, and I dove in head first. And the weight dropped off super quick. From the outside, I looked incredibly healthy, but I went from one unhealthy relationship with food to a completely different one. I mean, the relationship between wrestling and food, perhaps more than any other sport and food, well, I mean, certainly some others, is incredibly unhealthy, especially at the time that, in the 80s and 90s when I was doing it. I ended up wrestling at Ohio State, a Division I program, which was an incredible program. And this entire time, I had nutritionists and doctors and coaches and people telling me how to eat, and none of it felt right. Food at that time was something that scared me. Food was something that prevented me from maybe making weight, or maybe being able to compete. And then after I finished being a college athlete, the weight came back on very quickly, and I started suffering from all sorts of different metabolic disorders, irritable bowel syndrome, just overall bad health. I was heavy again. When my wife and I first met, we would go out to a restaurant, and I would remember that on the way to the restaurant, I was looking for places that had bathrooms, because I couldn't make it home without having to go to the bathroom at least once. And I mean, it could be a 15-minute drive and I'd have to stop. So there were all kinds of, and I didn't realize it was all had to do with food, and the food that I put in my body, because I had tried everything. I was doing Weight Watchers and South Beach and at all the different, major diet fads. Weight would come off, weight would come back on. But no matter how my outward appearance was, I never felt health. I never sat down to a meal and got up and felt nourished and connected the way food is supposed to make us. So over time, I ended up becoming an archaeologist for a variety of different reasons. And the part of archaeology that I'm focused on is something called experimental archaeology. So I'm trained in a number of different prehistoric technologies, like stone tool technology, or primitive ceramics, or basketry, those sorts of things. And what I do, in addition to excavating sites, is when people find artifacts or bits of things, they would bring it to me, and it's my job to replicate it and try to better understand how it was made in the past, or how it functioned, or what purpose it served, right? How useful it was. And eventually, when I had my first child, our 16-year-old daughter, when she was first born, my wife came out, the story we always tell is, she came out into the garage. I was in the garage banging rocks, because learning to make stone tools is a very long, exhaustive, multi-year process. And I'm banging rocks and banging rocks. And she comes outside. It's not as simple as this, but this is the simple version. And she says to me, well, can you come in the house? I'm like, yeah, I'll be in just a minute. She's like, no. Can you bring this, this passion, this drive, this knowledge, whatever you're doing, can you bring it into the house? You have a family. Can you make it help? Can it help us in some way? I mean, the stone tool thing is great, but can it help us? And she was right. I sat there, I thought very long and hard, why spend all this time and energy and effort into trying to learn something and do something and change something if it's not going to help the ones you love the most? So I thought real long and hard, what can I do? How can I make stone tools relevant to my, several-month-old daughter? How can I make these things relevant? And what I realized, and this is it was a powerful realization, almost every single prehistoric technology, and I mean beginning 3.5 million years ago with the first stone tool, almost every single prehistoric technology has something to do with food. Either getting food, or processing food, or cooking food or storing it or redistributing it or sharing it or whatever. Almost every single one. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, like literally the entirety of the time our species and our ancestors have been on this planet, almost all of our effort has been towards doing something different with food than any other animal. And what does that mean? Like, what does that mean for our diets? What does that mean for the way that we eat? And this is what it means. This is what I've come to realize. And some of you have heard a little bit of this spiel before, but I'll reiterate it because I think it's powerful, really. And it's the basis for everything that I'm doing. What I've realized is humans are one of the weakest species on the planet. We have an incredibly difficult time accessing resources from our environment to use as food. When we think about it, we have a very difficult time doing this. We have, our nails are almost useless. We pay people to get rid of them, right, to cut them off. We paint them. Our teeth have actually shrunk over time, and compared to other animals, don't do a whole lot. Our digestive tracts have shrunk to almost half of what they should be in a similar sized primate. All these biological features that we have that allow us to get food are nothing compared to other animals. Like, if you think about it, if I stripped you down naked and threw you in the woods and said eat, even if you knew all the poisonous plants and the edible ones, what could you get? And how could your body make use of it? And so, but the most important thing, and what I want the topic of tonight to be about, is for as incredibly difficult as it is for us to access food from our environment, it's even more difficult for us to make use of that food. Even when we can get resources, our bodies are not adapted to most of the foods that we eat. And it makes sense why it's not, because as we were creating technologies to extract different resources from our environment, we were also creating technologies to process that food before it touches our lips. Cows can go out in the field and sit on and be on grass and support huge bodies that outweigh us by several fold. And meanwhile, we could go eat the grass and our bellies would be distended, but we would starve to death. Ducks and geese are designed to eat grains, raw grains directly from the stalk. But if we try to do the same thing, it would actually make us incredibly sick and we wouldn't be able to get much nutrition from it at all. What humans do different from almost every animal on the planet is that we create technologies and behaviors to do three things to our food before it touches our lips. Makes food safe, nutrient dense, and bioavailable. And it's important to understand that many of the foods that we eat are inherently not safe for us to eat. We have to do something to it. And just as important, many of the foods that we eat, especially plant-based foods, do not give up their nutrition easily. We have to do something. It doesn't mean we shouldn't eat them. It means we shouldn't eat them without thinking. We shouldn't eat them without doing something, what we're supposed to do to them, what our ancestors were doing to make that food as nourishing to our bodies as possible. Because when we eat a food, it doesn't guarantee that the nutrition it contains goes to where it needs to go in our bodies. The only thing that you can guarantee about putting food in your mouth is that at some point it's going to come out the other end. Because our digestive tracts are actually tunnels with a filter in the middle. And if everything is operating properly, if that food has been processed properly, if your body is healthy, you're eating that food the right way, that filter will take the maximum amount of nutrients and deliver those nutrients to your body where they need to be. But if any of those things are off, it's not going to happen. So when I talk about food, and some of you might have read the thing that we put out, it's a draft and probably typos in it. I'm working on a blog post about it. But I was thinking to myself the other day in the midst of all this coronavirus stuff that's going on right now in the news, in the communities, people really worried about getting nutritious food into their bodies. One of the things that I think is incredibly important for us to consider is, what is food, right? Food for other animals is what they can eat that their bodies are physically adapted to derive nutrition from. And to them, anything other than that is not food. It's not even though they could possibly put it into their mouths, they don't consider it food. Humans are completely different because we have the ability to take a number of different resources that our bodies are not designed to eat and transform them into something that's safe, nutrient dense, and bioavailable, or safe and nourishing. But if we skip that part or bypass that technology part, the processing part, then that doesn't guarantee that that's food safe. And I'll leave this sort of intro piece with this final thought, and then we can go on wherever we like. The problem in my mind, when we lump all the different foods available to us as food under the same category as food, that those subcategories become meaningless when we talk about diet and health and nutrition and sustainability and ethics and all of it. So categories like bread, to me, it's a meaningless category, or dairy, or meat, or any of those categories. Because within that category, if you say to me, okay, a lot of questions I have after I speak are questions like, oh, should humans eat bread? You know, bread's only been in our diet for at most 15,000 years, at most. You know, humans, Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years. Should humans eat bread? And immediately the question is meaningless, because what do you mean by bread? Do you mean Wonder Bread? Or do you mean a long fermented loaf of sourdough bread? Because they're completely different foods. Same thing with dairy. Should humans, you know, big question I get all the time is, should humans be consuming dairy as adults? Because about 60% of adult humans lose or suppress the ability to produce lactase, the enzyme that allows you to break down the sugars, lactose, in milk. So should humans be consuming dairy as adults is a big question. Well, is it ultra pasteurized skim milk, or are we talking about raw fermented dairy? Because again, they're completely different foods, and it's not necessarily the ingredient, the thing. You know, we ask our nutritionists, you know, should we eat this? Should we eat that? You should eat this many calories of this. Or you shouldn't eat that. These questions that we ask nutritionists are questions that we shouldn't have to ask. We're the only animal that says, do I have to eat this? Or should I eat this? Or should I not eat this? Because, believe it or not, we can have the long conversation about this if anybody wants, but we are programmed. If we're in tune with our bodies and we're faced with nourishing food, we don't have to ask what to eat. Our body will tell us what we should be eating. The question that we need, just like every other animal, the question that humans need to ask is the question that rests on the thing that we do differently as humans. We process our food first. We get it ready for our bodies. The question isn't what should we be eating? The question we should be asking is how should we be eating? How do we approach that food to make it as safe and nourishing as possible? Right? Again, we go back to the bread. Should we be eating bread? Well, Wonder Bread, I would argue there's absolutely no reason Wonder Bread should ever touch our lips. But I would very easily make a counter argument to say that a long, slow fermented sourdough bread, and we can talk about why, definitely can have a place in an extremely healthy diet for humans. And the same sort of thing with fermented dairy is a completely different food. Grass-fed meat, organ meats, nose-to-tail approaches to animals, fermented grains, fermented vegetables, nixtamalized maize, all of these sorts of processing strategies to get food safe and ready for our bodies is what we should be concentrating on if we're thinking about a healthy, nourishing diet. And the really cool thing is, and this is what I'll leave this opening with, the really cool thing is, if we approach food using these real time-tested ancestral technologies, right? If we approach food that way, the really cool thing is not only does it make food safe and nutrient-dense and bioavailable, but it also makes meals satiating, makes food delicious, right? These signals that our bodies have spent millions of years honing to tell us what we should be eating and what we need, they're triggered by real food. You know, we should get up from every single meal feeling satiated, which means feeling full. And I don't mean full like you got to open your belt on Thanksgiving, right? That's not healthy either. But you shouldn't, it is very possible to be eating a diet that is the healthiest diet possible, a diet that you're losing body fat on, a diet that you're gaining muscle on, and feel full at every meal, right? We have this idea that if we're being gluttonous and celebrating, we should overstuff ourselves. And if we're trying to be healthy, we should go without, right? We should leave the table hungry. And it's not true. Approaching food the right way, nourishing food, means that you're creating food that's not only safe and nourishing and delicious, but it's satiating, it's filling, it's pleasing to all of our senses at the same time. And I know that was a lot to take in the beginning, but what I would love to do, if we, because I understand we have time for questions and discussion, is to guide. I can unpack any piece of that that's possible, but I thought I might throw a few maybe new ideas out to see where everybody is and what you're interested in. So are there anything you want me to unpack further? Any questions? Any thing that you take issue with? Anything? Yeah.
Well, Bill, I'd like you to talk a little bit about like what kind of processing for meat or for vegetables, you know, if there are things that we can do, or just make sure we buy things that are processed in a certain way that are going to, without maybe doing it all ourselves, you know, that would make things healthier options in terms of vegetables and some, you know, lean meats and things.
Okay, absolutely. So one thing that I'd like to say, now we do in our house and at the food lab, and I'm glad you brought it up earlier. It's very important to us to cook everything entirely from scratch. Part of it is just because it gets me really excited and I like to do it, right? But the main reason is because there's so much information about food out there, and we are disconnected from our food. And I feel that the best way to reconnect and, you know, be able to, you know, see through all the marketing and all the labeling and all the big food industry tactics to get us to buy foods and whatever. The best way to get through that is not to ask somebody and not to read something else, because everything you learn is biased. And I even my presentation tonight is 100% biased. I completely understand that. But the best way to do it is to take the foods that you eat all the time and cook them from scratch at least once. I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to cook every single thing in their house. There's a lot of things preventing us from being able to do that. But there's nothing stopping you from taking the foods that you eat every single day. And I don't mean the meal that you eat at Christmas or Thanksgiving once a year. I don't mean that. The meals that you eat every day. If it's grilled cheese and tomato soup, if it's a hot dog and hamburger, I don't care what it is. But if you cook it entirely from scratch at least once, you will know more about that food, how it's made, all of it than you ever did, even if it's inedible. And even if you buy it every time for the rest of your life after that, you're going into the grocery store more aware and than ever before. And the best thing you can do at that point is use your money to not only buy the right food to nourish yourself the best way, but also support the people that are doing it the right way. So with that said, I just say that because you mentioned cooking stuff completely from scratch. Couple things. Some of these ideas are going to sound really strange because they go against a lot of the diet mantra in the past 20, 30, 40 years. But at least if you want me to, again, unpack anything further, I'm happy to do it. But do me a favor, if something sounds really, really strange to you right now, because I'm about to say so, I'm setting you up for a couple things that I'm going to say they're going to sound really strange. Do me a favor, hold on to them, think about them. I'm happy to have further conversations with anybody about them, but think about them because some of these are literally life-changing ways of approaching food and diet. One of them is about vegetables. We eat a lot of vegetables in this house. So I'm going to say something about vegetables that sounds really crazy, but bear with me for a minute. So I have a book at publishers right now, and the opening chapter of the plant section says something like, "Plants should scare the hell out of you," is the first sentence, and they should. Again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be eating plants. We've been eating plants for millions of years, well before we were eating meat. But one thing that our disconnect from our food has produced is an ignorance about the amount of toxins that are in plants. It's important to understand that every single plant, I mean every plant, from lettuce to tomatoes to cantaloupe, I don't care what it is, have toxins in them. They have toxins. Now, many of these toxins, a lot of them have been suppressed over time through breeding, and a lot of them aren't as toxic as some toxic wild plants, but all of them have toxins. Many of these toxins require incredibly high levels to harm us, and we'll never reach that level. Some of these toxins are completely negated by things like cooking or fermentation or what have you. But some of them will build up in our bodies over time. And one of those toxins that's a really big issue are oxalates. And I've only recently in the past year really become aware of oxalates. I don't know if anybody here has heard much about them, but I have some personal experience with it. I'm happy to share some stories, but I'll point you to a woman. I'm going to say a few words about it, but there's a woman named Sally Norton, who's a nurse in Virginia, who is leading the charge, educating people about oxalates today. Oxalates are like these little tiny shards of glass under a microscope that are inside of certain plants. and they're really bad for your body. And when you ingest them, your body grabs them and sequesters them in different places and stores them up and like builds things around them to try to protect your body. They build up over time, and eventually if it gets bad enough, it can result in everything from arthritic pain to things that people diagnose as gout, which is not gout, kidney stones, gallbladder stones, all sorts of major issues. These are the plants that contain oxalates, high levels of oxalates: spinach, kale, almonds, oranges, and the list can go on and on. But these are all plants that nobody would question, right? I mean, these are spinach. Are you kidding? Spinach is the healthiest thing on the planet. It's not. Now, I don't want to dive too deep down this rabbit hole. The reason I bring this up is because if you are looking, one of the approaches to food that we should think about in some cases is our consumption patterns. How much of one thing should we eat? How much of others don't we eat? How do we process certain things? And one of the issues, these oxalate issues didn't seem to be a huge thing in the past when people were eating hyper seasonally, right? There's nothing wrong with eating spinach, but we've taken the seasons out of the grocery store, right? We eat spinach every day. Like if you want to be healthy, there are people who make a spinach shake every single day. And that becomes an issue, right? If you eat spinach when spinach would grow naturally around here and outdoors in a garden, and then the rest of the year you're not eating spinach, that's fine. But if you're eating spinach and kale shakes every day, and then you're popping a few almonds every day, and then you're drinking tea, which also has oxalates in it, you can have huge, huge problems. And I'll just share with you a quick story about the power of this. This woman, Sally Norton, grew up on a Swiss chard and rhubarb farm in Virginia. Both of those plants contain high amounts of oxalates, and she ate massive quantities as a kid. By the age of 19, she could barely walk. She was so crippled. And she spent decades of her life like this, and finally got into nutrition, and finally realized there were these things called oxalates. And when she removed them from her diet, and she spent decades in a state where she could almost not walk and in incredible pain. When she removed them from her diet, within 6 months, she was 7 hours in high heels at a wedding dancing. I mean, that's the radical transformation. Again, this isn't a plant meat debate, which seems to be this thing raging in the dietary world right now that we are not paying attention to today. That's a completely different thing. But that doesn't mean that we should, I used to have this idea that when you you want to be healthy, you go into the produce section of the grocery store. I mean, how many people, you don't have to raise your hand or anything, but how many people can relate to this? You say, okay, today I'm going to buy healthy groceries for my family. And you walk in, and of course you go right into the produce section with your cart, and you look around, and the image in your head, the thought in your head is, everything here is healthy for me. I need to eat more of this. In fact, some is good, more is even better, and you load your cart with all these vegetables. And you know what? There's, again, nothing, and vegetables are incredibly healthy for us if we eat them the right way. But there's we should never be approaching diet and health with that mindset of not thinking about it. Let somebody else tell me how to do this. I'm going to ignore all my body signals and just, do whatever. So this is a long answer to your question, Ann. The one thing I'd like to say is, if you're eating vegetables, large quantities of vegetables, take a look at what they are. Make sure that you're eating them in a safe manner, and also make sure that the nutrition they contain, by the time it reaches your mouth, is in a state that your body can actually do something with it. So there are certain vegetables which have high amounts of calcium, but most of the calcium that's in vegetables is in a state that our bodies can't access very readily. The calcium is better obtained from an animal source, which is in a different state, and our bodies can do more with it. So explore things. Now, you don't, again, have to cook everything 100% from scratch at home, but one thing that's incredibly easy to do, and it's empowering, is one of the most transformational food technologies we've ever invented in the past, is fermentation. And it is one of the easiest things to do. And takes a raw vegetable, fresh vegetable with a certain nutritional content, and transforms it into something else with just a little bit of salt and thyme. So raw cabbage is one food. Sauerkraut, real sauerkraut, is a completely different food. There's more vitamins. The nutrients are more accessible. Our bodies have to work less hard to access those nutrients. And we have the added benefit of a flavor and a texture that we can really, really enjoy. So real quick, I want to touch on the meat thing, and then we can move on. Another thing that our disconnection from our food has produced, which is, in my mind, created some incredible problems that have to do with both nutrition and sustainability, but also the ethical treatment of animals and workers, is the distancing we've had from our food source. We see this as a convenience, right? We don't have to think about the death of an animal. We can go buy chicken breasts in the store in a package, and we don't have to worry ourselves with that part of it. But in reality, when we've turned our heads, what's going on behind our backs in that modern meat processing world is atrocious. It's terrible, and it's our responsibility to keep an eye on these things, right? It hasn't been a convenience that we've been sheltered, viscerally insulated from this. So one of the things that visceral insulation from our food source has resulted in is this idea that we no longer see chickens and cows and pigs. We see chicken breasts, or we see pork loin, or we see ribs, right? We forget that we forget an entire animal died, right? Lived a life and died for us, which, if we're nourishing ourselves, I'm completely fine with that if that animal was raised and slaughtered in the right way and every bit of it was used. But we also forget all the components of the animal, right? We've been eating meat for 3.4 million years, minimum. We know for sure we've been eating meat for 3.4 million years. And never has it been somebody going and killing a chicken and taking a chicken breast and throwing the rest of it away. Like, there's so many people that consider themselves meat eaters that eat nothing but lean chicken breast, or eat nothing but pork loin, or a sirloin, or a porterhouse, or whatever it is, right? That's not eating meat. Or if it is eating meat, I want no part of that. What we have always done as a species, and our ancestors have done, is they've eaten animals. If anything about our diet and health have to do with nutrient density, right, as a factor that's involved with that, meat, believe it or not, even though it's so much more nutrient dense than plants or fruits or vegetables, it is one of the least nutrient dense part of an animal. I mean, it is the most nutrient dense part of animals. And I know this sounds controversial, but listen, organs, blood, fat, brains, that's where all the nutrients are in the animal. Meat is nutritious, don't get me wrong. But the things that literally built us as a species are the other parts of the animal. And I'll give you one quick example and move on. So we started eating meat 3.4 million years ago. There wasn't a huge change in our bodies anatomically. Our brains really didn't grow much, and our bodies really didn't grow much. But 1.5 million years later, at 2 million years, we started hunting, right? So instead of scavenging the leftover stuff, the carcasses that were left from other animals, which, believe it or not, was the flesh, the meat, because they ate all the good stuff, we started hunting. And when we started hunting, the difference between scavenging meat on the savannah and hunting is that as hunters, we have first access to the most nutrient-dense part of that animal, right? It wasn't eaten by the lion or the whatever. We get to eat the organs and the blood and the fat and the brains, right, and the marrow. Those things are right there for us. And then when that happens, our bodies transform almost to modern day size in both body size and also in brain size. So you mentioned meat and you mentioned lean. The reason I bring this up is because animal fats have been in our diets, well, for definitely 2 million years, and in the form of marrow for 3.5 million years. It's only recently that we've been concerned with fat as something in our diets. Right. And I do think we need to be concerned with fat. But here's the takeaway shopping message here. And again, a little bit controversial. In our house and in the food lab, we use massive quantities of high quality animal fat, lard, tallow, duck fat, schmaltz, whatever, butter. But we rarely use vegetable oils. Nut and seed oils are not allowed in the food lab, and nut and seed oils are not allowed in our house. Nut and seed oils have been in the human diet for a little bit more than a century. And the first seed oil that was used for anything was cottonseed oil, a byproduct of the cotton industry. And the first thing that it was used for was lubrication for machinery. Then they started, after a while, they started feeding it to animals. And then over time, only after they developed the technology to deodorize it, change the color, and change some of the other qualities of it to make it something that we'd actually put into our mouths, did we start serving it to humans. So, and nut and vegetable oils break down at very high temperatures. So here's if you're going to take one thing away from this that will literally transform, I'm convinced, your health, I would get rid of all nut and seed oils in your house and if you're going to use any vegetable oils, avocado oil and olive oil are not nut or seed oils. They're actually fruit oils. And they're a completely different thing because they give up their oil very easily, right? They're very easy. It doesn't take high pressure, high heat, chemicals, none of that. So olive oil or avocado oil we use for cold applications. We do a little cooking with olive oil, but mostly dressings and mayonnaises and those sorts of things. And we do use some coconut oil, which is a nut oil. That's the only one. But again, it gives up its oil so very easily that it doesn't require high temperatures and high pressures. We do not cook hardly at all with any of those nut or seed oils. So the big takeaways of that, and let me recap real quick. Vegetables are incredibly healthy if we approach them the right way. If you're going to look up something after this, I would spend time looking up oxalates because I'm convinced, and everybody I've talked to about oxalates and has changed their diet with oxalates have told me that much of the pain and swelling and inflammation that they've been experiencing have gone away or at least subsided after getting oxalates out of their diets. One word of caution with that, however, is one of the problems with the oxalates is that your body sequesters them in mass numbers. And if you have a very high oxalate diet, you have a good amount of it stored in your body. And if you take and completely remove oxalates from your diet, you're going to feel great for a couple days. But then when your body realizes you're not taking them in, it'll start flushing your stores of the oxalates, and then you're going to feel terrible. So if you're somebody that has a very high oxalate diet, if you eat massive quantities of kale or spinach or Swiss chard or almonds or any of the other ones I've mentioned, and you want to make a change, then I would check out Sally Norton, and she can help. She has a lot of information on how to slowly remove these things from your diet so it doesn't overwhelm you. So that's with the plants. The second thing I wanted to mention, right, that I mentioned was with animals. If somebody gave me the option of eating a lean cut of anything or a fatty cut of the same thing, I'd take the fatty cut immediately for numerous reasons. One is there's an incredible amount of, assuming that animal's raised properly, incredible amount of nutrition in that animal's fat. And believe it or not, all the flavor is in the fat as well. There's a reason that we like, and the satiation, all of that. And the second thing I would, again, don't forget there was an animal, right? That was a whole animal. So there's nothing strange about humans eating meat. We've been eating meat for 3.5 million years. There's something strange about us eating the same cut of animal from the same 3 animals every week of our lives. There's nothing natural, nothing sustainable, nothing really ethical about that. There's actually nothing nutritional about that either. If you have the ability to make the change to start introducing all sorts of offcuts, and maybe, believe it or not, one of the most nutritious parts of an animal is actually its liver. I mean, if you look at both a macro and micronutrient load that's coming out of different parts of animals, its liver is almost unmatched. So even if it's just learn how to make a basic chicken liver pate, which is incredibly simple to do, and it freezes incredibly well. And the other thing is, as far as vegetable oil is concerned, I'd almost exclusively get rid of them, except for the ones that I mentioned. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I hope that helps a little. All right, other questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
We have so much industrialized food that we purchase nowadays. I mean, that's what's available in most grocery stores. There's industrialized meats, industrialized dairy products, even industrialized vegetables. And I know that the nutrition in a lot of them has probably gone down. How do we navigate that?
That's a good question. So one of the things I think we need to understand, and I just spent a little bit of time talking about diversity of different parts of animals, but one reason, now people buy processed food for a lot of different reasons, right? One is convenience, but another is, and you can't really get around that very easily, because a lot of those things are built to be easy. We pay for it on the back end when we're visiting the doctors too much 30 years later, but the convenience immediately is something that's hard to match. But another reason I think that we buy processed food is because of the appearance of diversity, right? We have this thing in our head, we shouldn't eat the same food every single day for every single meal. So we buy these packaged foods. So instead of eating like an egg 3 days a week, which is easy to make, we buy these packaged things, and then Mrs. Tyson's this and Mr. this and whatever. But the reality is the major foods that go into those processed foods are always the same thing, right? It's almost always the same junk. So even though it looks different, it's packaged different, it might taste a little different, it's the same food. So one way to navigate that is to not be incredibly, if you're eating the right macronutrients, if you're eating the right major staple foods, and to me, those are basic foods coming from really high quality sources. So high quality meats and fats and eggs and cheeses that are real ones. The diversity almost takes care of itself, and there's nothing wrong with eating eggs. I know I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. 1 year you weren't allowed to have more than one egg a week, and the other year you could have 3 eggs, and then one time you're not allowed to eat egg yolks. It's all a bunch of bunk. Eggs are amazing, one of the most amazing foods on the planet. So one way to navigate it and get around it is to realize that, a basic cut of meat thrown into a pan with a few vegetables on the side literally gives you more than you can imagine, right? And if you did that 2 or 3 nights and ate the leftovers, there's nothing wrong with that. People aren't eating enough leftovers today. Another way to, now it's going to sound like a lot of time on the front end, but it's something we do in our house quite a bit. We've taken up, we've taken to doing quite a bit of butchering in our house. Now, I don't mean you're bringing in a whole cow and throwing it on the counter, although we've had half a pig in our kitchen quite often. But even a whole chicken, if bringing in a whole chicken like people used to do 10 or 20 years ago, can produce a high quality chicken, which looks so expensive compared to the $1.69 a pound, whatever, sitting next to it in the grocery store. But one high quality chicken, if you buy the entire chicken, brought home, and can be turned into at minimum 2, if not more than 2 different meals, and then end up with bone broth at the end of it. But that initial investment of time to take that whole chicken and break it down and partition it the right way and do the things you need to do can make the next 2 or 3 nights worth of meals just as simple as a takeout meal or a processed food meal. And you have complete control over literally every single ingredient that goes into it. And I don't know if that, it's not a great answer, because you're right. You can't beat that convenience. But again, you pay for that convenience at the other end. The other quick little note I'd like to say about time and cooking and investment and all that is, we've set up our lives, our daily routines, to accomplish a certain number of things, food related, that end up making the other days very, very easy. And we've just sort of worked them into our routine. We spend 5 minutes doing this before bed. We wake up and do this. So I refresh the kefir in the jar before I go to bed at night. Or, we're getting ready to bake a bunch of bread. My daughter started maybe you might have seen it. She started a sourdough bread company called Rise by Brianna. She's delivering, and she's doing sourdough focaccias and charcoal crackers and sourdough breads. But, she's going to do all the baking in a couple days. Tomorrow night, we refresh the mother. And it takes 5 minutes, but all of a sudden the next day I have enough sourdough mother to make, as much bread as anybody wants. To making yogurt at home, it's an investment of about 45 minutes of time. But you know what? The yogurt will store for a couple weeks, and you can make 2 gallons worth of yogurt in that 45 minutes, and it's higher quality yogurt than you can get at the grocery store. So I hope that was helpful a little.
I'm interested to know your take on fruit.
Oh, I thought somebody was going to say fruit. It's controversial. Are you ready?
Ready.
Yeah. So we have fooled ourselves into thinking that different types of sugars are healthier than others. So there's fructose and dextrose and sucrose, and they all do the same thing to our blood sugar. Our body responds to all of them in the same way. So there's nothing inherently about the fructose in, say, a banana. There's nothing inherently better about that than in something else, right? Than in, say, table sugar. The difference is that fruit does carry with it some advantages, right? There's vitamins and there's enzymes in fruit. In some cases, there's other things that you might want in different fruits. And don't get me wrong, there's a ton of pleasure in eating fruit as well. The problem is when we look at our ancestors and think about that they were fruit eaters, you know, our ancestors 5 billion years ago ate a limited amount of fruits, wild vegetables, and insects. That's the only things that they ate. But their fruits look nothing like what's in our grocery store. You know, a banana has a higher percentage of sugar in it than a can of Coca-Cola does. And we don't think about it. We just, without thinking, we just say fruit's healthy. No, fruit is not healthy. Fruit and the fruit in our grocery store looks nothing like its wild counterparts do. Have you ever seen a wild banana? A wild banana is not a fraction of the size of a commercial banana and is a fraction of the sweetness. So if the question is, can wild fruits be a common component of a healthy diet? Absolutely. But that's not the same thing as saying what's in the Acme is the same, because what's in the Acme has been bred to be sweeter, has been bred to be bigger, has been bred to be uniform. And at the same time that people were breeding for sweetness, the nutrient content was actually going down. So for an average apple today has, it depends on who you're talking to, but somewhere around 30% or so the nutritional value of an apple in 1950, right? It's bigger, it's sweeter, it looks nicer, it's more uniform, but in order to get the same nutrition that we actually need from that apple, we have to eat like 3 of them to get the same nutrients that we got in 1950. So it's not as simple as saying fruit. So if sugar is something you're worried about, if spikes in insulin or something, if those things are something you're worried about, then I would not just go eating fruit without thinking about it. However, I would say, just like with honey and maple syrup and fruit, as far as what that does to our blood sugar, it's exactly the same. However, if you're going to go ahead and eat something sweet, you might as well get some good stuff with it too, right? So again, if you're eating fruit, you're getting vitamins, enzymes, you're getting all that. If you're eating real maple syrup, it's got tons of minerals in it, which are incredibly good for you. If you're eating honey, it's got all kinds of wonderful things, including probiotics if it's raw honey. But don't fool yourself into thinking that it's a health food. It's something that's sweet, and it's doing the same thing. Now, again, it's some of the sugars are bound up in cells, and they get released a little bit more easily than eating a spoon of sugar. I completely understand that. But the fruits today that you have access to in the grocery store are something that we should think about them like people only a few generations ago thought about them. Something sweet, something you would have for dessert, not something that would be the main part of your meal. Now, let me just say something very quickly. I know it sounds like I'm taking all the fun out of food, right? Like, oh my gosh, this guy's telling me I can't eat this, and this is what I enjoy. Listen, you can eat whatever you want, obviously. But I will tell you that I am 47 years old. I was a Division I athlete for one of the best wrestling programs in the country. I am 47 years old, and I have never enjoyed better health than I enjoy right now. And I have never enjoyed my food more than I do right now. I do not leave meals hungry. I do not leave meals feeling distended. I do not leave meals feeling poor. I leave my table feeling nourished. And you should do that every single day. And I will tell you, it was only a few years ago that I was getting up and I was like, man, I'm in my 40s, and that pain I feel in my ankle or my knee, or I'm hearing something when I'm going up the steps, that's just the way it's supposed to be. No, we've normalized pain. It's just getting old. No, it's sometimes, but a lot of it is a product of how we're treating ourselves. A lot of it is a product of how we're actually eating. And I will tell you, again, from irritable bowel syndrome to other metabolic syndromes to pain and inflammation, it is gone. It is all gone. And again, I'm not getting up from the table like, oh, I wish I could have had something else. Satiated, full, and nourished. And that's how you should leave every single meal. All right, other questions?
What about stevia?
It's a good question. We don't use it in the house. Again, there's something to, when we don't eat a lot of things that are sweet, we really don't crave anything that's sweet. So we don't. We were trying a little bit. We were messing around with, I played with the monk fruit, right? And the other thing I forget the other thing that people are on keto try. We tried a little bit of that. But there's two things there. One is I still don't trust it. I just don't. I think there's a little bit of bitterness with it. But there's also something, there's triggers that your body reacts to food because of the nourishment it contains. But there's also a strong gut-brain link as well. And just because food, a sweetener has very little carbs in it, doesn't mean it doesn't trigger certain responses in your body.
I wondered, yeah.
So is it in moderate amounts? Is it better than table sugar? Probably. But again, I will be completely honest. When we cut out most of the sweets from our diet, we don't crave them. We really don't. And another thing to think about too, the power of fermentation. So if you're on a low carb diet or thinking about a lower carb diet, there's a lot of foods that start out with sugars and carbohydrates that through natural or through traditional processing, they get eaten, right? They're gone. So there's a big difference between drinking a glass of milk and eating that same amount of dairy in cheese or in yogurt or in kefir. And one of the big differences, there's a lot of differences. One of the differences is that the fermentation that takes place in dairy is called lacto fermentation. And it's called that because it's lactobacillus bacteria, which it lives on eating the lactose, the sugar in the milk, right? So by the time you're done fermenting kefir or yogurt or real cheeses or a whole host of other fermented dairy products, by the time you're done with it, it either has very little lactose or no lactose in it whatsoever. If you ferment, yogurt usually ferments for 8 to 12 hours, but if you ferment it for 20 hours, there's no lactose in it at all. It is a naturally lactose free, but it doesn't have those sugars, right? So if you look at same sort of thing with vegetables, same thing with wine, right? Grape juice is filled with sugar, but that sugar is food for the yeast, right? And depending on the fermentation and the bacteria. So by the time it's transformed into wine, the sugars aren't there, or they're there in very low amounts, unless they've artificially done something to it with the sugars, right? But so again, this idea that we're talking about categories of food that are meaningless because we're not taking into account the traditional processing that should be involved with them. So the end product is different for our bodies. So that's same thing with cabbage, right? Cabbage has a large amount of carbohydrates and even sugars in it. But by the time you fermented it to make sauerkraut, much of that has been eaten up and used by the bacteria and is no longer present. So you can eat these foods that at one time contain quite a bit of carbohydrates or sugars, but by the time they're ready to go into your body, then much of that has already been gone. And let me just say one thing about, I'm sorry, I know I keep talking, but sourdough bread, just because it's a good example. So the earliest example of bread right now is about 13,000 years old. And it actually, believe it or not, it's actually in a place where agriculture didn't develop for another 1,000 years. So it was made with wild grains. It was definitely some form of sourdough bread. But for at least 13,000 years, in many parts of the world, there's been some sort of bread in traditional diets. In all of those cases, the fermentation it's been a wild fermentation that's been a combination of a yeast and bacteria fermentation. This is really, really important. So I hope I can explain it properly. When you make bread and put commercial yeast in it, the only fermentation that takes place is a yeast fermentation. And it eats some sugars, and it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. And the alcohol gets burned off when you cook it. So the carbon dioxide is what leavens the bread and makes it get big and soft and have all the air pockets on the inside, right, the holes. When you use a sourdough fermentation, it's a combination of, it's wild, but a combination of bacteria and yeast. And the yeast leavens the bread, makes all the holes. But the bacteria transform the grains into something completely different. It takes the bad part of the grains, things we call phytates or phytic acid, things we call lectins. Many of the problems that many of us experience by eating bread are a result of these toxins in the grains. It gets rid of them. It detoxifies them, and it also breaks the grain down. It digests the grain and pre-digests it for us, so the nutrition that is available there is more easily available to our bodies. So the final product could look the same. It may taste the same. It may smell the same, but they are completely different foods. One is just grains that's been leavened, which are still dangerous for us. And the other ones are grains that have been detoxified, partially digested, and that bread has been leavened. They are two completely different foods. So, if you're going to say, well, we've been eating bread for 13,000 years. Yeah, but the bread that we've been eating for 13,000 years is nothing like 99% of the bread that we have access to in the grocery store.
Where do you get the sourdough starter?
It's a great question. So actually on my website, there's a place on our website that has a really good recipe for making the sourdough mother. So it's drbillschindler.com, drbillschindler.com. Or if once a food lab gets rolling again next semester, if you let me know, I could bring some in. I'm happy to share, no problem at all. It's worth doing because one of the problems with sourdough bread is it's gotten a bad name because of the name sourdough. Now, one of the byproducts of the lactic fermentation is lactic acid, which is sour, right? So, but you can control the sourness. You can make a sourdough bread that is sour. You can make, but you don't have to. In fact, if you've made a sourdough bread that's really, really sour, then usually you've done something wrong. You can use the sourdough process to make croissants. You can make dinner rolls. You can make crackers. And again, if you don't want to make the bread, I got to put a huge plug in for Brianna because she's 16 years old and started this company, risebybrianna.com, and she will deliver to your door. She's got sourdough bread, sourdough focaccia, and sourdough charcoal crackers. Again, she's using that ancestral technique of transforming the grains through the both bacterial and yeast fermentation into the healthiest form it can be for our bodies.
Bill,
so go ahead.
You mentioned almonds, but how about nuts generally?
Nuts in general, yes. Unfortunately, nuts in general mostly do, but some have much more than others. So almonds are high. I believe cashews are high. Peanuts are somewhat high. But you'll have to look it up. I don't remember exactly. There's some that are high. I think pistachios are quite low.
Pistachios are low.
Okay.
I'm sorry? Pistachios are quite low, yeah.
A lot of pistachios, so that's a good thing. What about the food triangle that, schools are made to believe that in feeding kids in elementary school, the food triangle and that whole thing?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, I have a lot of issues with that. If you turned it upside down, it would be much more accurate. This is going to sound weird and strange. It's true what I'm going to tell you, but there's no nutritional requirement for carbohydrates. There's not. So out of the main macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, there's no nutritional requirement for the carbohydrates. But that doesn't mean they can't be a part of our diet if we consume them consume them properly. I was just reading a really amazing book called How to Eat Like an Animal. And it's a brand new book. And these scientists, they're entomologists, they study insects, but they took all different sorts of animals and they tested them from cockroaches to mice to humans. And what they found was, given the choice to just use their senses, they will always eat a diet to attain a certain amount of protein. Right? Their eating patterns always focused on getting a certain amount of protein. So if you gave them a high protein diet, they ate less because they achieved that amount, right? Eat more easily. But if you gave them a low protein diet, a high carbohydrate diet, they ate massive quantities of food solely to get to that amount of protein that their body actually needed. And at the same time, one of the other things they were eating was to keep there's a ratio of fat to protein your body actually needs. There's something called rabbit starvation, which isn't about starving rabbits. It's about rabbits are an incredibly lean animal. Not the ones we keep in our house. We feed them too much food. But for the most part, there's no fat on wild rabbits. And many domesticated rabbits we raise for food. And if you eat, you can get something called protein poisoning or rabbit starvation. If you eat too much protein without enough fat, your body can't metabolize the proteins the right way. It needs a certain amount of fat. So all of these different animals, when given the choice to just do it on their own, they always ate to a certain amount of protein and then tried to get that same ratio of fat. And the carbohydrates were just sort of there for the ride. Now, certainly athletes, growing children, pregnant and lactating females who have incredibly high nutritional requirements, they just actually need energy and need calories. There's something obviously a little bit different there. But for all of us who are just trying to be as healthy as possible and do what we need to do, we should really take a look at the carbohydrates that are in our lives, right? How much we're eating, but again, the quality of those carbohydrates.
Well, you guys, I am sorry to break in, but it's 6 o'clock, so we're already keeping you past your 45-minute time. So I think we'll wrap up, but we will put this, the video of this discussion up in a couple of days, and, we'll follow up with some email. And Dr. Schindler, are you happy to have people get in touch with you if they have further questions? Or I know that people can go to your website.
You can go to my website. There's a ton of information there. You can feel free to contact me. And when we get kicked up again in this fall, I don't know what, none of the colleges in the country know what they're doing yet in the fall. None of us know what we're doing in the fall yet. But assuming everything's, rolling again, please come by the food lab. We're, at least for First Fridays, we're usually open on First Fridays and doing a ton of different things. But if you see us in there, stop in. I'd love to show you around and tell you a little bit more about what we do there. If you're looking for a sourdough starter recipe, you can find it on my website. If you're just looking, I got to put another plug in for my daughter. If you're looking for just the sourdough itself, it's Rise by Brianna. Feel free to email me with any questions at all. And again, there's a lot of information on my website and also on the Food Lab's website.
And can we find information about your daughter's company on your website as well?
Christina, is that on there? Brianna's website link? Dr. Bill Schindler? We'll add it.
I was going to say, I ran across it earlier, just looking for intro info. So I always follow up with the participants, and I'll make sure I include a link to Brianna's business and to your website. And so a couple of things you mentioned today, so everybody who's attended here can follow up.
Awesome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We like to end with a little toast, so I'm gonna just I'm gonna say that the connection that I noticed is that you were talking about what is food and what do we use food for, and the need to not just get sort of what we think of as what we need, but to also feel satiated. And I would say that especially in this time when we're all so isolated, we also need that socially, and we need that in our relationships. And that's part of what we're doing these salons for, is to give ourselves that sense of satiation and what we need in terms of social interactions, because we're not getting that so much. And that's in all of our senses as well, just like food. So that's why it's nice to see everybody on these calls. So here's to what we need in our bodies and in our minds. And thank you, Dr. Schindler, and thank you everyone for coming. And join us next time too.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you
you all for
so
coming.
much. Thanks for
Thank
taking the time.
you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.